Professor Griffin.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank Marion Casey and everyone else at the Ireland House for sponsoring this and inviting me to speak. So the quotation from the Phillips discussion that I want to use is the general rule. As worded back then, it is a general rule that every man, when legally called upon to testify as a witness, must relate all he knows. This is essential to the administration of civil and criminal justice. And I want to talk about the general rule today because in 20th century discussions of religious freedom, we're still perplexed by that question of how binding the general rule is on everybody. And so if you think of current free exercise jurisprudence, as Steve just referred to, the leading precedent since 1990 has been the Smith case. The Smith case involved Native Americans who used peyote in a religious ritual. And of course, the use of peyote in the religious ritual violated the drug laws, and they were fired from their jobs and then denied unemployment compensation benefits. And the question is, well, how should the court deal with that general rule that drug use is illegal under the drug laws? And the interesting thing in comparison with Phillips, right, is like the Phillips sacramental setting, right, where this is real, where the confession is really a sacrament of the church. Here you have what's uncontestedly a religious ritual for Native Americans, the use of peyote, and so a ritual or sacramental setting. And we say, well, how should the law, how should the Constitution, how should the First Amendment, how should the Free Exercise Clause handle the claim of the Native Americans to exemption from the rule that governs everyone else? And of course, in a very controversial decision, the court held that the Native Americans, like all citizens, are held to neutral laws of general applicability. And that's the statement of free exercise, right? The First Amendment does not constitutionally mandate exemptions from the general laws. Now, this decision was in some tension with some earlier cases. Presumably Phillips, a lot of people usually think of the Wisconsin versus Yoder case, where stricter scrutiny applied. And so you say, well, what happens to the Amish parents who don't want to send their children to the public schools, right, completely through high school? And they say they have religious objections to doing so. Should we say that the education laws apply neutrally and equally to everyone? And what the court said in Yoder, and also in the Sherbert line of cases, was that, well, if government burdens religion, then it has to come forward with a compelling government interest, right? And so we value free exercise so much that when your free exercise of religion comes into conflict with the law, then the court will say, you get an exemption. And so in that sense, right, Phillips lines up with the exemption line of cases and not with the Smith line of cases. It lines up with the exemption line that says, well, free exercise really means that even when the government is passing these laws, it can't burden your religion so much that it undermines your religious practice or your religious ritual. As we see in Phillips, right? Imagine that the government could just come in and order a priest to testify, right? What would that do to his religion? What would that do to his faith, right? To imagine that he would have to break the rule of his faith. And so we have now in the Smith versus Yoder, Sherbert, Phillips line of cases, this tension as to, well, what do you do if the Constitution doesn't require an exemption, right? Which is the Yoder and Phillips approach. What are the other possibilities? Well, of course, what Smith left open is that you can pass laws that accommodate religious freedom. And so now we can say, well, you could see, right, and that, in fact, is what has happened with the clergy penitent privilege, right? The clergy penitent privilege is part of the law of evidence. And so we say, okay, in order to accommodate religion, instead of kind of letting the courts figure out what's protected by the Constitution, we'll say, hey, the legislature is going to value this clergy penitent privilege and protect it in some way. But of course, the hard questions, as always in the law, are how and why. And so if we start with Phillips and we say, well, do you want to recognize a clergy penitent privilege, but in doing so, recognize that maybe it's only the Catholics who need it, right? Because all the other religious groups might not have something called confession. with a seal that's so absolute that it can't be violated. And so we say, well, what does it mean to accommodate the Catholic confessional? Does it mean we say, well, for the Catholic sacrament of confession, we'll have a clergy penitent privilege? And how will you pick the scope of it? Will you let the theological beliefs of the church about its absoluteness determine the legal scope? Or will you say, no, we're going to recognize the privilege, but we're going to hold on to some state interest, right? So that maybe if the person is confessing future crime, right? And there we might draw parallels to the attorney-client privilege. Well, how will we define the scope of this privilege? We might not give it the absolute theological view that the church would give. And so you wind up with a balancing of interest, right? And so already, if you just say that the goal is to protect the Catholic confessional because its religious practice is different, you say, well, there's two ways to look at that, right? You can say, on the one hand, the legislature is doing a good thing. It's accommodating free exercise. It's recognizing a diverse religious practice and trying to make room for it in the law in a spirit of tolerance, right? And that's the other language, in a spirit of tolerance rather than persecution. You'll try to accommodate this religious tradition in the law by saying we won't force the clergy into court to testify. And so we can say that under the First Amendment, the promotion of free exercise is a good thing, and therefore it's a good thing when legislatures recognize a clergy penitent privilege. But there's always the other side of the Establishment Clause that says, well, the Establishment Clause doesn't allow the government to promote religion or prefer one religion over another. And so what happens under establishment if you say, well, only the Catholics really have this sacrament of confession, but we don't allow the government to favor one religion, just one. We don't want the government favoring Catholicism. And so what will we do to promote neutrality or equality, right? What will we do to meet the establishment goal? And that's what the actual case law of the evidentiary privilege has developed at, right? Trying to figure out, well, even if this clergy penitent privilege started in a concern about Catholic confession, what do we do to try to treat it in a way that's neutral and equal among religions if we don't want any one religion getting special privilege? And of course, I think, right, as Professor Green suggested, right, in his first anecdote, right, you could have all kinds of different churches with all kinds of different ministries and all kinds of different pastors, right? A church where everybody's a minister, right, or a church where no one's a minister. And so how do you, in a fair way, protect religious freedom without favoring one group over another? And the interesting history of all these clergy penitent privileges has been originally ones protected, some of them protected only confessions by Catholics, and then more and more, because the Establishment Clause, they expanded to try to figure out, well, how are we going to promote this privilege in a neutral way and in an equal way, right, without any preference or favoritism toward religion? And then the question becomes, right, well, that relates back to why you have the privilege. And if, as modern cases say, right, a lot of the modern cases say, well, you know, individuals need a moral and religious place to go, right, where they can go and sound out their deepest moral and religious failings and maybe be heard and understood. And you say, if that's the purpose of the clergy penitent privilege, then can we define it in a way that's broad enough to include everybody? Right, or will it still only favor certain religious groups over others? And so we wonder, right, well, what if you go to and talk to a nun? Should that get the penitent privilege? What if you, right, talk to the parishioner in the church? So we have more and more struggles in an era in which First Amendment law favors equality and neutrality to figure out how you can set up the contours of the clergy penitent privilege without running afoul of our concerns about establishment, right? How do you promote free exercise of religion and be tolerant of diverse religious practices without winding up favoring religious individuals over non-religious individuals, or favoring some religions over others, favoring religions that have confessional-like settings over religions that don't? And so today we see not the attempt just to accommodate one hard practice like the Phillips practice, but how do we expand beyond that to be inclusive of everyone? And I think in order to do that, right, the focus of the privilege law has to be more and more on the individual. And so we could say, well, can we equalize it by saying, well, every individual needs a moral and religious place to go, right, where the person can say honestly and truthfully what's happening, right? The moral and spiritual equivalent of the attorney-client privilege. And that we'll respect that because of our concern for the individual's freedom. But that sets up another tension that arises in our newest free exercise and establishment case from the Supreme Court, and that is the Hosanna-Tabor case, which was the first time that the Supreme Court has recognized the so-called ministerial exception. Now, what happens in the ministerial exception is that an employee, in the case that went to the Supreme Court, an employee of a Lutheran school, Cheryl Parrish, got sick and went on disability leave, and then was fired when she came back to work. So she tried to sue for disabilities discrimination, as the general rule allows her to do. So we're back to general rules, we're back to Smith. But what the court said is that because of both the free exercise and establishment clauses, the court had to recognize a ministerial exception to the anti-discrimination laws. And that means that somebody defined as a minister cannot sue her church. Now, we have just one Supreme Court opinion on this, and so the contours are big, right? But what it sets up is this idea that when there are disputes between individuals and their churches, the courts can't get involved. And so we're left with concerns about the individual religious freedom and the institution's religious freedom. Now, how does that relate to the clergy penitent privilege? Well, who's the privilege supposed to protect? Right, often when we teach the attorney-client privilege, we say, well, the reason that we have the attorney-client privilege is because it protects the client, right? It's the client's. It's not the attorney's privilege, it's the client's privilege. It's the client who can waive the privilege, right? It's supposed to protect the client. And so we say, well, how do we view the clergy penitent privilege, right? If we carry over the traditional notions of privilege, we might think, well, it protects the person who confesses, right? The criminal defendant who has gone for moral and religious guidance. And so should we put all, and that, when we said that was a main reason, that was a neutral way to justify the clergy penitent privilege, right, is to say, well, this is something for all individuals of whatever backgrounds, right? We have to acknowledge a privilege that all individuals can enjoy. But of course, as we see from Phillips, right, there's a huge claim from the clergy to say, well, no, it's right, it's my religious claim, right? It's a doctrine of the church. It's something I have to hold on to. And the way that breaks down in the case law, right, is imagine you're a defendant who says, hey, I want my clergy member to testify, right? Because, you know, I said good things. So, like, get that clergy, but right, I said all the right things about how I didn't do anything bad. Let me get that clergy member in there to testify about what happened in confession. And yet, the clergy member says, nope, right, as a matter of religious freedom, I don't do that because there's such a central sacred claim. And so I think more and more we think that as we move in some of the religious freedom cases to an emphasis on individuals or rules that will protect individuals of varying faiths and no faith at all, we could run into tension with some of these rules that are rooted in concerns about the clergy side of the clergy penitent privilege. And so Smith has set us up with the tension of who has to follow the general rules, but Hosanna-Tabor has set us up with that potential conflict between individual religious freedom and institutional or clergy religious freedom. And so I think, right, that Phillips is there on one side of this long debate about how you tolerate and not persecute religion, right? How you strike the proper balance between being a tolerant place that promotes religious freedom without running into the problems of the Establishment Clause. And that's always the issue anytime we try to accommodate religion, right, is that we try to promote free exercise without running afoul of establishment. And so Phillips gives us some guidance on that, but of course hasn't provided a final answer. So thank you very much.